Hello, everybody. Pleased to welcome you to the AHURI Cities webinar. My name is Dr. Tom Alves. I'm the Head of Development at the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, known as AHURI. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm meeting with you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and I also want to acknowledge and welcome Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us on the webinar today. Kate Dundas with me here is also joining me from Wurundjeri land, whereas Francesca Perugia is on Wajak Noongar, and I'll allow her to acknowledge that when she begins. This is an exciting time for us. This is a webinar within our Cities program. A number of you may have attended webinars from our housing research program, but we're excited to be doing a Cities webinar today. And we're going to be hearing shortly from Francesca Perugia, who completed a scoping project as part of our research program looking at the issue of climate change adaptation in Australian cities. And it was a scoping project really coming from the fact that we were well aware that Australia has signed up to the New Urban Agenda at the Habitat 3 conference in 2016 with the United Nations, and also is a signatory to the Paris Climate Agreement. And we were just thinking that a lot of, I guess, what the implications of that are for Australian urban policy have not been thought through in any great detail, and we were keen to put some research out in the field that begins to look at that, and particularly in the international context. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. But before we launch into the webinar proper, I am pleased to announce some upcoming events that AHURI will be hosting in the near future. One is a one-day conference in Sydney on the 9th of May, which looks at the circular economy and housing in Australia. And it explores the issue of what it will take for the Australian housing sector to become more integrated into a circular economy. Early bird registration for this one-day event is currently open and closes on the 15th of March. The Australian Homelessness Conference in 2024 is being held at the Adelaide Convention Centre on the 13th to the 14th of August. Registrations for that are not open yet, but they will be open next week, I believe. So please keep an eye out on both of these upcoming events, and you can subscribe to AHURI News to maintain regular updates on both of those and other issues. Now, before I introduce our speakers and our topic for the webinar today, I just want to give you a few instructions around using the webinar platform and to give you some housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded, just so you know, and that is so that you can return to it at a later stage, also so that you can share the link to it with colleagues and friends who may be interested in revisiting the topic later on. At the end of the webinar today, you will receive a survey, and we would really welcome your feedback, and this helps us to continue to refine and improve our webinars and to ensure that we're presenting information that's useful and interesting to our audience. Now, about participating in today's webinar, you have the opportunity to submit questions to the presenters, and the way to do that is to type them in to the Q&A section, which you will see on the right-hand side of your computer screen. You can please submit your questions at any time at all during the webinar and the presentation, and I'll seek to address as many of these as I possibly can once we've heard our presenters talk and we start to engage in a conversation together with you. We will also have the chat function open again on the right-hand side of the screen, and you're very welcome to use this to communicate to the other participants in the webinar today as it progresses. And maybe as a way, I guess, to break the ice and get started in using that, you may wish to let us know which land you're joining us from today, so feel free to pop that into the chat. Okay, so now to today's session and today's presenters. I am delighted to welcome you to this Cities webinar, which is on the topic of adapting Australian cities to climate change. Our key presenter today is Dr. Francesca Perugia from Curtin University. Francesca was the lead author of AHURI's report, which is called Improving Australian Climate Change Adaptation Strategies from International Experience. And this explores climate change adaptation practices, strategies and policies which have been implemented internationally and that could be adopted to better support Australian cities and towns to be more resilient, particularly in the context of increasing risk, and fire obviously is a very pertinent one of those today. This report, along with a policy evidence summary associated with the report and a standalone executive summary, are now available in the chat for you to access, and they are also and always constantly available through the AHURI website. Okay, our first speaker today is Francesca Perugia. Francesca is a senior lecturer and the course coordinator of the Urban and Regional Planning program at Curtin University. She's an early career housing and urban researcher and has extensive knowledge of urban systems in Australia and internationally. I'd also like to welcome Kate Dundas, who you can see on the screen as well. And we've invited Kate to, I guess, offer a bit of a response to the presentation and the report following Francesca's presentation, which will help kick us off into a discussion. So we look forward, Kate, to hearing from you a bit later on. Kate's the Executive Director at the United Nations Global Compact Network Australia, where she leads the Australian Network's Secretariat of the world's largest sustainability initiative. Kate has over 20 years' experience in strategy, operations, futures foresight, data, sustainability, urban design, and community development across both the public and private sectors. All right, so the format today is we'll hear from Francesca now, and then we'll hear that response from Kate, and after that I will facilitate a discussion between our participants, and I will draw on, I guess, the issues and questions that you, our audience, have raised during those presentations. So please do stay on the Q&A part and put in some interesting thoughts and questions there for us. We look forward to hearing those. Anyway, Francesca, we're really looking forward to hearing from you right now. So I'll be quiet and hand over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're actually located. Before I started, and I would like to acknowledge that I'm actually joining you today from the Roja Would like to acknowledge also all the different nations from which all of you are actually joining us today, and pay my respect to the elderly, past, present, and emerging of all these beautiful nations that are across our Australia, and also acknowledge all the Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal people joining us today in this presentation. So let's get it started. And I think it's very relevant, given that we're talking about city and caring for places, to acknowledge the people that have taken care of Australia for a very long time before us. So just quickly, an overview of what I'll be presenting. As Tom has said, this presentation draws from the report. There are part of the report that I won't be discussing, otherwise we'll need 2 hours to go through all of them. But I will. The presentation will be divided in 3 main parts. We'll provide an overview of adaptation, why we decided to look at adaptation, what is the international policy framework in which adaptation works at the local level. It's important to recognize that what we do at local level is actually framed by the international, as Tom was saying, commitments to achieve certain goals and targets around sustainable development, disaster risk reduction, and addressing climate change in general. And also touching on the issues around assessing climate change adaptation strategies. The second part, I will present the case studies that are actually also included in the report. These are 3 case studies that have been chosen because they address three of the major natural disaster weather-related events that actually impact Australia, that increasingly been impacting Australia for the last 10 years, which are flooding, cyclones, and bushfires. And then lastly, I will discuss or I will share with you the discussion which I had with some experts across Australia, or what are the barriers and opportunity to actually implement some changes in the way in which we approach adaptation in Australia, based on the funding and the lesson learned from these international case studies. So let's get it started. Understanding adaptation. Why adaptation seems the most irrelevant or rhetoric questions. We do know that natural disasters are likely to become increasingly common. We do know that Australia weather patterns are demonstrating to have changed, and we've been experiencing more flash flooding, drought, fire conditions, and since 1910, Australian temperatures have warmed up of an average between around 1.5 degrees Celsius. Actually, the state of climate reports put together by the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO is really giving us a picture of what is happening at the weather in Australia. And what do we know is that since 1970s, the southern part of our country has experienced less rainfalls and an increase in the bushfire season, while the northern part has actually seen an increase of rainfalls, which translates in an increase of those really dramatically extreme weather events. We talk about onset event in the case of this report, so flooding, bushfire, and cyclones, but we also acknowledge that there are other really extreme weather events that we're experiencing, including heat waves. And joining you from Perth, I can tell you the last few weeks have been particularly hard, with 3 or 4 or 5 days in a row of 40 plus degrees. But that's for probably another webinar altogether. We have a lot of numbers behind this. The New South Wales just released the National Disaster Risk Plan, and in the disaster risk plan, the numbers that have been actually included in the report that only regard to New South Wales are quite shocking. Only in 2022, the flood events in New South Wales affected 76% of the local government area, or to even say better, 98 out of 128 local government have actually been affected by the floods and have damaged over 15,000 homes and causing billions of insurance damage. And this is just one of the many numbers that continuously come through around the impact. So why adaptation in relation to tackling this? We do know that with increasing of these events, we will need to increase the resilience of our weapon systems. And there is 2 ways that we know we can approach climate change. One is mitigation, and mitigations entails all those efforts that we actually making to cut emission, and the cutting of those emissions will actually slow down the warming of our planet. But these efforts needs to go hand in hand with other type of efforts, which are adaptation efforts. Why? Because the science tells us that in the next 30 years, we will experience climate change linked natural events, disasters, and extreme weather that are actually linked to the emission that we released in the last 30 years. So we can't go back in time. There is actually a lag between when we do the damage and when we see the effect of this damage that we can't reverse. While we can stop, certainly we can't reverse those 30 years. So we will need to really improve our resilience and adapt to these new changes. So, but to be able to talk about adaptation, we really need to understand that adaptation has been very much slow coming into the discussion around policies, including urban policies, still very slow. Even though we were aware of the need of adapting for a long time. So the latest report from CSIRO, the 2012 reports that looked at the mega trends that will help us address climate change, identifies adaptation, and when the report came at the end of 2022, came as a shock, but actually looking back at the work that we've done internationally, that's been done internationally, the panel for climate change, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change 20 years earlier had already identified the need to prioritize adaptation, but really little has been done. And also to really better understand where the barriers were to adapt and really closing the gap between adaptation and policy making and governance. However, it wasn't until 2015 with the Paris Agreement that really the international community has acknowledged and recognized the importance of adaptation as equal to mitigation, and we'll discuss this very shortly. So why urban planning? Why looking at planning and governance around cities to really tackle adaptation? There is two main reasons why urban intervention are actually crucial in this space. One, which is sometimes not really put to focus, is the legislative agency that urban planning intervention have, and so they can really establish legitimacy for action. They're really backed up by a legislative structure. And the second is those kind of interventions or adaptations implemented through urban policy have an immediate effect. So compared to mitigation, the outcome, we can immediately see the outcome of the implementation of such adaptation measures. There is kind of a rewarding element to it, for which there is a, on an economic kind of investment point of view, you really have a quick return on your investment. Like you can immediately see that coming through. So it's so that's why we're looking at planning. But let's go back a step to that conversation around adaptation, and how adaptation has come to be part of the conversation in climate change. And this is important to really frame what happens at the local level. So when we, on a policy standpoint, so the climate change responses that we do under our individual responsibility are national and then trickling down states and local actions are really very much framed by the global response, the goals and targets that are set, that are set as overarching elements. And in discussing adaptation, it's very important to identify how adaptation has actually then emerged in that policy framework. And it's important to understand how it is defined and also how it aligns with that disaster risk management reduction and then sustainability and sustainable development. In this slide, you can see a very summarized version of a timeline of how this definition and roles, governance roles around adaptation have changed in time, and I'm going to discuss it, but you can find a more detailed version in the appendix of the report. So if the real conversation, the journey towards really cooperation, international cooperation around tackling the damage or anthropogenic action on climate started in the mid-80s with the Vienna Convention, if you're not familiar with. And that was the real first declaration intention from the global community that we needed to work together to reduce greenhouse emission. And that was to, there was a buzzing words around having a hole in our ozone and our atmospheres. And then that was followed in 92 with the drafting and the adoption of the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, also known as the Convention, and we're just going to call the Convention from now on. And this was the first legally binding document that really acknowledged for the first time climate change and called for intervention. And then we had 5 years later the Kyoto Protocol that really made that convention operational and reaching all the way to 2015 for the Paris Agreement. Without going into much detail, but what we can see from 1992, when really we acknowledge climate change as an issue, as an international community, and the need to act upon, to what we're doing today, there's been a couple of narratives that have stayed in time, especially when we look at adaptation. We, in relation to actually intervene in relation to adaptation, or the measured identified, looked or worked around enhancing and sharing of knowledge or how to act to improve adaptation. And also the second part is around financial commitment, and so provide financial resources to adapt. And this kind of main narrative that is around action, it's paid up with another underlying narrative that divides the responsibility between developed countries and developing countries. So for a long time, the developed countries were asked to reduce emission mostly and to financially support the other part, which is the developing countries, to actually adapt and to create knowledge and to share knowledge amongst them to really adapt to the damage that the developing countries were actually doing. This has then been paired up with a change in the understanding of what adaptation is. So it started in 92 with adaptation simply, or not really simply, being considered a byproduct of other measures. So adaptation was recognized from the beginning, but the convention actually said that those adaptation strategies were actually coming out as a byproduct of other measures, could be framed as byproduct of other measures that were put in place. Then in time, moving in time, adaptation started to be identified as a different elements from mitigation that required its own strategies. And that only happened in 2015, definitely with Paris Agreement. There was an acknowledgement in the Kyoto Protocol that said that measure to mitigation and measure to facilitate adaptation to climate change were needed. And they started to emerging as being independent, but really that division wasn't really verbalized and formalized until 2015. So we need to read that policy framework together with, or how the policy framework on adaptation around climate change that the Paris Agreement sets, with other things that are happening not much in the background, because the document of the Paris Agreement doesn't work in isolation. There are other documents that have actually been elaborated, and the international community was working on other initiatives at the same time. And one is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, or the SDG, as everyone knows them, and the Sendai Framework for Risk Reduction. So these three documents being formulated and discussed internationally at the same time, open really a discussion around the relationship between what does it mean to tackle climate change in the Paris Agreement, what does it mean reducing risk around natural disaster, but also sustainable development, and how adaptation can actually be the common denominators in identifying strategies that really tackle all of three of these areas. And so somehow each of these documents acknowledge and highlight this interconnection between these three areas of intervention. So the Paris Agreement recognizes the vulnerability that we need to, the strategies to adapt to climate change will strengthen resilience and so reduce vulnerability. So somehow linking back to the disaster risk management, and then at the same time frames adaptation strategies as contributing to create more sustainable development. So there is an acknowledgement, but there is not, but the document still sees those three areas of interventions as separate. The 2030 agenda on the other side really acknowledges especially climate change and disaster risk management, and really refers to the documents and really names the document itself. So the SDG 11 looks at sustainable city community, the SDG 9, and then the SDG 13. They all really refer to these areas of intervention around climate change and disaster risk, in particular the SDG 11, call for action of climate change, and really refer directly to the Sendai framework, and even goes down to identify strategies that are put in place in the context of disaster risk reduction as actually indicators of advancement in sustainable development. So there is a real link that starts emerging around sustainable development and risk reduction. While the disaster risk reduction, the Sendai framework really just acknowledges the convention and the climate change and the role that it plays in addressing climate change issues. So why this is important? So with the increasing emerging of looking at strategies for climate change, then that governancing and legislative structure became internationally formalized, for which now nations signing into these international agreements are called to actually demonstrate that are making progression. We have a mandate now that with the National Adaptation Plan, we need to demonstrate how we're actually implementing them, what it is considered, how the objectives are reached. And the Katowice Climate Package is actually asking us to assess and develop assessment to evaluate this progress. And this is where we reach a little bit of a difficult moment, because compared to mitigation, adaptation, it's very much, adaptation strategies have different impact in different areas, are very much localized issues. Mitigation is easy. We look at reducing emission. We have a number, it's one for everyone. It's clear and it's defined. Adaptation, yes, we can identify both qualitative and quantitative measure, but they will have different meaning in different local contexts. And this is because of values, context, cultural context, socio-economic context in which these adaptation strategies take place. The benefit, the economic benefit that they will bring, and what do they mean in that local context. And the other things that also the Productivity Commission pointed out in their own review of adaptation is also that, yes, there are other strategies that have as a byproduct adaptation, and it's very hard to quantify and discern what other strategies have contributed in the adaptation space compared to the strategies that were purely designed to address adaptation. So in order to actually then identify the best case studies to discuss, and the one that really were effective, I've embraced this framework that has been developed by Berger and Fall not long ago in 2019, and it's a great tool because it's based on descriptive elements and qualitative elements of adaptation, as well as more hard elements. And in the case of actually identifying and discussing the case studies that I will shortly be presenting to you, has been used to really organize the way in which they are discussed. So this framework proposed to look at what is the vulnerability profile of the context that we're looking at, what were the adaptation goals and target sets, what were the effort put in place to really make sure that adaptation was happening, and what were the results of those strategies, all framed within 3 areas of working, which is the leadership, the organization, and the policy. And these 3 areas have actually also been used later on to frame the discussion with the expert and to organize those information. So let's start looking at the more interesting part, which is the international experience. I've identified 3 case studies from 3 different places around the globe. 2 comes from the US, 1 comes from Spain. As I said before, they were chosen because they address issues that we're familiar with and we've been grappling with in Australia, which is flood, bushfire, and cyclone. They're also being chosen because they have different level of complexity and use different way of approaching the issues. Some are more extended in time, some are more shorter in the time frame of intervention, some are more structural, some are more policy-based. And also making sure that we were covering both more urban context and more regional context. So let's start with the first one, which is Tulsa and the flood management plan. Tulsa, if you're not familiar with this place, it's in the US, in the state of Oklahoma, and it's a city that sits along the river of the Arkansas River. The city has been experiencing flooding since its initial growth. So after the establishment of the city, they actually discovered oil and petroleum, and the industry really drove incredible development in the area. And so the initial settlement that was actually on the hills around the river slowly trickled down closer to the water and occupying the floodplain area, really going along the geography of the creeks and the water. Not really smart looking at that with today's eyes. And so the city had to grapple for a long time to actually understanding what to do. Since the increasing of the development in the 70s, flooding became like an annual event. But what really tipped the scale on the other side and the need to intervene was the 1976, when they had a major flood, which wiped out most of the city. And that tipped the first intervention, where a citizen-led group reached out to federal government for support. And that's what actually initiated the US buyout scheme. So the US buyout scheme that we see now was actually initiated in Tulsa by a group of citizens that were a bit fed up with having the place continuously flooded. That was the beginning of 40 years journey into flood management. And then the second crucial moment was 1984, when there was another historic flood event, and that the paradigm that shift completely, and they looked more structural element around flood management that we're going to look in more detail. So the goal of all this, and now all of this is put together in a flood management plan that has as overarching goal really minimizing loss of life and property, protect public health, increase public awareness, identify hazard, really limiting the building at risk, improving the quality of the construction and reducing the exposure to natural hazard, but also improving the government and the public response. So how together the government and the public work to make these changes happening. So over the 40 years of tweaking and working with different elements to intervene and improve the situation for the city of Tulsa. There are we can say that over the 4 years, there's 4 main areas that adaptation efforts that have been implemented, which I just summarized here, and I'm just going to go more in detail. The first one revolves around planning, land use, building construction, and water management on a regulative and planning point of view. Then investment in capital improvement, so really hard issues and hard interventions, but also the integration of different elements within the management, which means so especially in the water management, so merging the water management system, the green infrastructure, so the parks, with the hard structure of the urban water that comes from the built environment. So natural built related water management and parks, so an integrated approach to that management, but also active community participation. So these 4 main areas can be then broken down into specific intervention. So when let's start with the planning. So the planning revolves around a series of plans that are put in place. So there are overarching plan that works at the regional scale with the Arkansas River Corridor Master Plan, for which then the City of Tulsa interventions fits into. And then there is an overarching tool that has been developed, which is a master drainage plan that was actually initiated in 1984 when the flood management plan started. And this master plan identifies the goals, recommendation, and priority for flood risk reduction in relation to stormwater and how that links to the riverine flooding. And it's all included in a GIS system that is used by the government, but is also open to the public. So it's a shared tool for everyone to really understand issues. The creation of repetitive loss areas, which is a plan for which all that maintains an updated list of all the areas that, or all the houses that have been receiving payment due to being flooded through the National Insurance Scheme, and then see how recurrently this is happening, so then they can put in place a plan to evaluate what the situation needs to be. So it's a continually evolving plan of monitoring the situation after each flood. This goes along with the master plans of the blue-green infrastructure and the management of the water, which started, as I said, in the 80s when the first park was developed along one of the main river. So with the buyout and the freeing of the floodplain, the area was converted and redesigned into a park, which is a green infrastructure that works with the water, but also works as a retention basin off-site, so valley storage for all the stormwater detention that cannot be kept on site in the urban areas. So there's all this water management that comes through, which is also paired up with building codes around what can and cannot be done, not just in area close to the floodplain, but in general across the city, and which then is supported by federal overarching scheme. And one is the National Flood Insurance Program, which is offered by the federal government, by FEMA, which requires the municipality to adhere to certain standards for the citizen living in the area to be able to have discount on the insurance. And so the compliance required revolves around floodplain management criteria, identify the flood prone areas. And this is layered up with the community rating system, which incentivize both the government and the community to go above the minimum standard. And so they receive a rating that is based on 4 main areas of intervention. So how the public information is shared. So there's an element actually as a disclosure. So the government needs to disclose what the hazard areas are, provide freely available information, service and map, information about insurance. Then there is an element of regulation. So these are the elements that the governing structure needs to provide for the community to then receive further discount on the insurance. And that is an element to the community. So the community itself needs to demonstrate how it is involved in this through floodplain management, through community assistance, through community information and promotion around flood risk and preparation. So it's a real, it's a system that really, a rating system that really pushes the community. It's a voluntary system, but it's a system that pushes to go above the minimum standards and really get the most benefit from the insurance scheme. So as an economic benefit, but at the same time, hiding the capacity of the community to respond to risk. So what really Tulsa has done is been a comprehensive approach that looks on all sides. And the results a bit, it's not just Tulsa being awarded Class 1 rating under that community rating system, but also really changing how the flood control system is done and the tension basis and creating a really blue-green infrastructure that has been assessed and has demonstrated to have positive impact on water quality, but also restoration of wildlife habitat in around the city. And the implementation of all these strategies does not remove the occurrence of actually flooding. There was one in 2019, which was another historic flood. But in the aftermath of actually looking at what happened and damage, what came out is actually that the area that were under this legislation, they were part of the county of Tulsa that implemented all of this. The building were almost not touched, or the damage were very minimal, while adjacent areas that were not part of it, were not implementing these measurements, have been almost wiped out. So why it doesn't remove the risk? The 2019 flood really proved that these strategies were effective. If we have to summarize the experience of Tulsa and the long journey of 40 years to make all these tiny little tassels work together, can be really summarized as a kind of saying that Tulsa have found a really sweet spot between bottom-up processes. So initially in the 1917, citizens going to federal government saying, we need help. And some then in time top-down intervention around flood management. So, and they're all based on very long-term support, resilience building plan. It's not related to, it's not a lot of a small ad hoc. It's been a continuing assessing and adjusting to create a really structured support in time that has seen an improvement of both the governance, but also the way in which the stakeholders collaborate and talk to each other and have the same goal and aim in doing this, with a particularly really focus on making sure that this process are community-driven and the community is part, and so the community-based risk management is a big component of this type of intervention. And of course, the nature-based approach and integration, so they're not completely disregarding hard intervention when it comes to flood. There's still levees, there's still dams, but it's integrated with the way the water in the urban setting is managed and is integrated with the green infrastructure, the parks in the city, but also the valley and the whole system of green at large within and outside the urban environment. So really complex approach. The other approach that we looked at, the other case study, is called the Guardians, which stands for Green Urban Action for Resilience Fire Defense. It's very long, Guardians. It's a great acronym. And it's related to bushfire, something very close to us in this exact moment in Australia. Spain, as many other places in Europe, we've seen on the news what happened last summer in Europe. Really, really hot weather, which is increasing the occurrence of bushfire across dry lands, especially in the southern part of Europe. And so this area, this little township, is part of the Valencia region. Is inland. Valencia is the biggest urban center on the coast. This is going inland, let's say, at the back of the big development, the big urban centers in Valencia. It's really interesting because it has a lot of similarity to our context in terms of experiencing drought, very dry weather, lack of water, being inland, being somehow isolated and lacking some infrastructure, hard infrastructure, but also being some of those townships that grows in summer with tourist attraction. So it's a delicate situation. The town that area in the last between 2000 and 2016 suffered from devastating bushfire. There were actually 40 of them in those 16 years, which really triggered the need for better measurements of resilience. So it was quite difficult to manage. And also the other issues that they were experiencing, there's a very weak legislative framework in Spain and Europe around bushfire. In Australia, we have much more legislative framework, and we know this has been triggered by the events that we had, especially more recently. But also there's a very lack of risk culture in the local community, especially the more rural community. So what the project has done as part of, which is actually being funded by the European Community funding, a round of community fund, European EU funding for resilience building, is the project trying to lower the community vulnerability to bushfire by implementing sustainable water management, raise community awareness, and really using the natural element again. And this is quite an interesting element, which I think we can learn from. It's around really working across different problems, water management and dry weather, and lack of water, and also bushfire at the same time. So it's quite interesting. There is three main elements that are used in this project, strategies to solve or to address fire. There is an element of nature-based solution. So what they've done is, the disclaimer, so they have a term that we don't use much in Australia, which is wild urban interface. So this term, so the wildland urban interface refers to the area that is in between the wilderness, forest, in the case of Spain, or it could be our bush here, and the land occupied by human activity. So there's a little strip of land that is not forest, it's not wild, but it's not city, it's not human, it's not urban yet. And so that's where they're actually working. So most of the European work around bushfire, it's around managing that interface. We do have a way to do that in Australia, we clear it up. So what this project tries to do is to find a different solution to actually manage the area and use the buffer area to reduce risk, to reduce the risk. And so how they've done it in this case? In that little strip, they've planted over 35 hectares of multi-layered, low-inflammable vegetation strips. So instead of cleaning up of vegetation, they actually use vegetation to control fire somehow. I wouldn't say control fire, but control the condition to lower the risk of fire. That's the best way. And that's paired up with a water recycling system. The diagram is quite small, but I'm trying to give you a quick overview of how it works. So the water system works with, there's a treatment plan that for the wastewater that is linked to an irrigation equipment. So water tank, and they actually built physical structure, giant sprinkler towers, 35 of them across the urban interface, so that little strip. And it works using the water reclaimed for fire mitigation protection, but also the current water that is there with the wetlands and ponds that are actually in the valley. So how the network works, there is a series of sensors that trigger the irrigation. So along that area, that's called preventive or pre-defensive, there is what is called a defensive irrigation system. There are sensors that are activated when the land becomes too dry. So the irrigation system waters this area and the soil become more moist, and so it reduces those fire risk. And then those same sensors, when it's a proper fire, then are linked to a more defensive system, which are the sprinkler towers that get in action when there is actually an emergency. So it's quite a complex system, but it's a really interesting way of actually linking water, recycling water, and also using vegetation instead of clearing vegetation in this area to reduce the risk. And the last piece of the puzzle is the community and creating community awareness. As we know, in Australia, remote areas or regional areas can be really difficult to reach when there's several emergency happening at the same time, and that's what they're trying to address through that community awareness. It's not just being awareness. So the programs that they've launched and they're actually implemented are not just making people aware of what is happening, but really also increasing capacity for firefighters, because often when the fire season starts in Europe in these regional areas, the firefighters are not able to respond simultaneously to different calls, and also because the firefighters are also called to do different jobs. They are called to suppress the fire, but also they need to organize community evacuation. They need to then look at destruction protection at the same time. So it's a lot that's been asked, and the community is not prepared for it. So through this program, they share those roles. So they count on the community to actually be able to be part of that system, which means then ensure a better outcome. What has been quick overview, they actually developed a really interesting diagram that puts this together. They call this an integrated fire management strategy. So that is, and the four main components of this, as we said, is the green belt that act as a fire barrier. There is the recycling water system that does both preventative and job through irrigation, but also fire suppression. The raising of community awareness, but also the overall ecosystem in the area has been increased. So the result is that actually the ecological condition of the area have increasingly improved, same that has been recorded in Tulsa. So actually adopting this nature-based solution has great impact on the quality of the water and the environment and the habitat and the species that lives in this area and the wetland. And it was also in this case, Spain and other southern region area of the southern region of Europe have this increased risk of fire that is heightened by some land, agricultural land being abandoned because they're not able to actually make it fruitful and economically viable, which increases the risk because it's land left to itself. So this new wetland has really recharged the water cycle and have improved the situation. And of course, the people to self-protect themselves. So again, looking back at the lesson, the Spanish study says the others. Are we seeing this improved governance, community resilience, and nature-based integration all together?
Francesca, can I just jump in for a second? We're running a bit behind time, so I'm wondering, is it possible maybe to skip over this particular case study and jump straight to the conclusions?
Yeah, I'm just gonna. Yeah, this one is very quick, so I'm gonna do very, very quickly just to say what it is because it's important for the other one. But I would just do it in a minute. So My Safe Home is just a program, and it looks at a cyclone. And in the case of cyclone, and Florida, as we know, is affected yearly. In America, they call hurricane. But what is interesting, this is it's just a program. It's not an integrated approach. But the good things of this is have these three elements again of the mitigation, but as a really interesting aspect of having inspections. So people get an inspection to the home. They get a report that says what are the retrofitting measures that they need to put in place to kind of increase the resilience of their dwelling. But also interesting, they have an estimate of the cost that of those works and how that will benefit the insurance premium discount. So how that will benefit and lower the cost. And it's supported then by grants to help people that cannot make those implementation in their dwelling to actually do some retrofitting. The importance of this is of this program that seems quite obvious on us. We do sometimes this type of program in Australia is that it's actually embedded in the legislation. It's not a one-off program, and it really looks at continuous maintenance of the dwelling. And this is something that we can relate to in Australia when it comes to cyclone. We do have building regulation, but we do not have a follow-up program that constantly makes sure that those buildings are up to the codes and are up to the standards that it needs to be. And the outcome of this is that actually they looked at some numbers and it really has a positive impact. So the state has actually paid for an independent review, and they actually found out that in the lowest case scenario, if people put in place the minimum change, they get back $1.5 of saving for each dollar that's actually spent to do this. And in the highest scenario, where actually all the possible retrofitting interventions are done, you can save up to $2.5 for every dollar that you spend. So there's an economic return to this, but also a big return. And we do know this when it comes to community and community disruption caused by being forcibly moved out of houses that are not longer doing what they're built for. So it's something that we do, but this project, I think, adds an element of legislation and continuity in approaching this that we don't have in Australia. So looking lastly, and this is the shortest part, as I said, I discussed all of this with several experts across Australia, and this expert range in the expertise from climate to environmental sustainability, urban policy, and really have worked across different sectors. So they could really offer a different perspective and a different view on these issues. So what I was saying is that we looked at three elements of approaching issues of adaptation in Australia, which is around leadership, organisation, and policy. And the kind of conversation that we had, let's start with leadership. So I'm just very, very briefly saying this. So we need to understand that adaptation in Australia is seen as shared responsibility. That was set up a long time ago in 2012 with the COAG, which is the Council of Australian Governments, which doesn't exist anymore. But we just kept that approach throughout all the adaptation policies that we look now. So the Australian government at federal level, it's called to support and coordinate policy and program that then gets delivered at the lower level, and the federal government is responsible for financially supporting investment in this area around risk reduction. We do know we have several grants in the area that comes from federal government, and then really perform legislative duty in relation to adhere to those international obligations that we said before. So, but while the government has this responsibility, they don't have direct responsibility over the land. That we know that this goes back to our constitution. So the states are actually responsible for legislating around land, and so then at the local level, it's where all those efforts are actually implemented. So that's how the leadership works, and then each one of us is responsible for their own part. What do the experts say? What are the barriers? There was a general sense by everyone there is a lack of leadership, and this is something that also came through the Australian Productivity Commission report done in 2012 around the barriers to effectively climate change adaptation. So what the experts said is, they said that there is a real division of power and in the allocation of the responsibilities. So through the three tiers of government, so something that we heard many times, that silo mentality in the governance, and also through the legislative autonomy, especially at state levels, because everyone can develop their own legislation around everything that's related to land management. And so also what they pointed out is a real disparity between what is done in one state from what is done in another state. So things can be done really differently across the same country. And also they said that this division is actually exacerbated by the fact that there is not a strong position by the federal government around environmental policies. So because that relates to state, there is not a strong direction, and said this, for them, this is a real issues. And some of them actually state government actually also worked at federal level as well. So it was quite interesting to see that coming through. Where do they see the opportunities happening? They see the opportunity happening at the bottom and trying to do bottom up, which is what actually in reality is already happening in Australia, with the local government really driving the innovation around the space of adaptation. But what we don't see, due to that lack of overarching leadership, according to them, is what we've seen in some of the case studies as Tulsa, that we can really find a sweet spot where the top-down interventions can really meet the bottom-up. So there is a lot around the bottom-up that is happening, not just through community-led programs that are often funded in Australia through state and federal funding and grants, but really being then translated into some more solid government approach. And so that the institutionalized of really this process somehow, or formalized that really, or where the opportunities are, just really leveraging on what is happening to consolidate it. Around the organization, again, if we go in the context, that division of responsibility in adaptation is then really reflected in who is physically the organization that is responsible within the government at different level to enact and bring that leadership forward. And what do we know is that as federal level, there are different portfolios. So the responsibility of climate change is divided into different portfolios. So each one has a bit of responsibility in that overarching issues, not just under one portfolio. And then the agencies that actually are responsible for this are different and sits within different departments, and often the adaptation. So we do have now the NAPO, which is the National Adaptation Policy Office, and the agency doesn't sit, for example, together with the National Emergency Management. So we're still seeing that risk and the adaptation as separate. We just don't bring it together. And at the state level, it's the same as we were saying before for the leadership, because there's different states do different things. Then that translates in different form of organizations around who is responsible for what at the state level. And so some states have ministers, others don't. Some have a separate climate change portfolio, others don't. We do know Victoria is the only one that really legislates around adaptation, requiring the government to actually produce adaptation plans every 5 years. No one else is actually legislate this in Australia. So looking at the barriers that were identified in the organization, it's really much, again, about this fragmentation. But what was really felt as a really strong point is that these organizations are linked to politics, and those issues shouldn't be linked to policies, and the time frame, the political time frame and lifespan doesn't really match the time frames that needs to be considered to actually address those issues. So that there is this discrepancy in between the political drivers to take some action and the action that needs to be taken. So on a time frame point of view, there is a disconnection for which one is longer than the other, and the shorter one is the political one. And so to achieve some success in the political one, we tend to cut on innovation because innovation requires more time, and we tend to do things on an ad hoc basis, but just applying the same principle all the time and just slowing down innovation. And so one of the things that emerged in the discussion was that it wasn't seen as positive by everyone, but was discussed was an independent authority responsible to look after this that is not linked to political will. Still, this is seen as controversial because some of the stakeholders said that an independent authority, it will never be effectively independent, and they raised the issues of the 2020 independent review of the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Act and the effectiveness of really of the autonomy in this space. And lastly is the policy space, and I'm done 1 minute. In the policy space and national level, we have strategies where the effective regulatory frameworks are established at the state, mostly at the local government levels. And what is seen is that the frameworks and the strategies are not strong enough at the national level to really give direction to states and trickle down. They're seen as being not strong enough. Strategies don't mean necessarily action. So that was the things that emerged, and also the consistency in the approach again, and policy integration as well. So working in silos, that silos approach in the organizational and leadership is reflected then in the outcome, that is the policies. And they really, there was a call for a more structural approach at the federal level that is around legislation, not just strategic framework, because strategic frameworks are not binding in the action sometimes. So,
We might just stop it there, Francesca, just because we're running a bit over time. So I might cut straight to, and we can leave those up on the screen if we like, so people can read them. But I might just quickly jump now to Kate Dundas, who's the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network Australia, to give some of her thoughts and reflections. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, Tom. How long do you want me to take? Just a couple of minutes?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay, I shall zoom through. Hi, everybody. I'm coming to you from Narm on Wurundjeri lands. I'd like to pay my respects. And I'm currently working as the CEO or Exec Director of the UN Global Compact Network Australia, which is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. But prior to that, I was an industrial designer turned landscape architect turned urban strategy person turned energy and circular economy person. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the things I've seen on my way through my career. So the first is probably just doubling down on the importance of local government. We saw through many of the examples that Francesca had presented how important community engagement and community knowledge is. And really local government is at the coalface of adaptation. We know there's many homes in Australia that underperform. The AHURI have lots of research on that. They're not insulated, they're freezing or boiling. And when it gets really hot, local communities that are connected and know each other often fare better. So sharing information about things like cool spots, libraries, shopping centres, sharing air conditioning amongst neighbours. And local governments can help to create these connections because they know their communities best. And also can use digital technology to assist. And just a shout out to the work that's happening at the City of Melbourne. They're doing things like cool routes, which many of you have probably seen, using digital mapping to show you how to walk about the city in the coolest way possible. You know, where's the best shade. The next thing is urban governance. So I've worked across a number of urban renewal areas in Victoria and getting tangled up in issues of urban governance, which can either help or hinder. The 79 LGAs, local government areas in Victoria, and I think 34 of them are in Greater Melbourne. So we don't actually have a metropolitan governance system. It's lots of councils with lots of boundaries. So you can imagine, you know, when things like flooding infrastructure is required, it crosses many boundaries, not only of LGAs, but also water authorities in the state. So I remember sitting in, you know, many meetings where we were talking about places that were going to get flooded often as climate change impacts started to hit, thinking, well, who's going to pay for the pumps? Oh, it's you. No, it's you. Is it? Well, are you sure it's us? How are we going to pay? Because the developer contributions go to the state. They don't go to local government. So we had all these conversations, and honestly, they took years, and I think they're still going on. So we can think about getting better at urban governance, and many of the case studies, again, talked about that. Also, we needed entirely new urban design guidelines for flood-prone areas that try to manage the conflict between sensitive uses at ground level and creating beautiful places. So I think the Tulsa case study was really interesting in that because it talked about the planning response, capital improvements. But I think what we didn't do particularly well was the multi-objective planning. It's complicated, but really important, and community participation, which again, we saw through the case studies around how important that is. But the conversations always ended up in how much return do the developers get? How much open space can we provide? Because when you're providing open space that floods, you can't use it for sport, you can't use it for nature, so you need more of it, and it costs money. I'll just quickly touch on the importance of a just adaptation. You know, we've always heard about or talked about recently a just transition. I think the same thinking applies to adaptation. And Francesca talked about the SDGs at the beginning, and the SDGs are a really useful way to think holistically, to make sure that when you're making a policy intervention or writing a business strategy or actually anything, you can use the SDGs to make sure that you don't have any blind spots. So you might be doing really well in energy, but actually there might be slavery impacts in your supply chain. So checking the SDGs is really important. And Future Earth Australia have identified some building blocks for transformational change that address injustices. And I think it's always really important for us to think about how to recognise all people in their knowledge, foster inclusion of communities experiencing marginalisation, address injustice, transform through adaptation, really in a just way. So thinking about how we, don't do the things of the past and don't just give power to the people who already have it, but empower Indigenous leadership and embed a just adaptation mindset. And finally, so we can get to questions, I think just thinking differently is really important. This is going to sound like a slight tangent, but I'm doing a course at the moment in sustainable stand-up comedy, and they're teaching us about look at the absurd things in life and try to make a stand-up routine. But actually now I'm just thinking about all the absurd things in life. Like the way we actually design our lives isn't terribly helpful for resilience and adaptation, because you need time in your life for it. You need time to build community connections. You need time to grow your own food. You need time to retrofit your own home if you're not going to spend lots of money doing it. But we all work full time, most of us. We build big fences in front of our houses or just drive straight underneath them, so we don't often get a chance to build community connections and meet our neighbours. We start work at 9 o'clock. We drop our kids off at 9 o'clock. We do silly things like that. We build enormous houses that cost heaps to cool and build them not close to public transport. So there's an opportunity for us to just think about those things that are normal and do them a little bit differently, and think about how we understand our own biospheres, our own local places, our own communities, and how we can work in partnership with local government ourselves. And also, Francesca spoke about the power of nature and thinking, well, what does nature do? Because actually there's lots of tips. So let's harness that magical and wonderful power of nature and work with it rather than against it. The end.
Thank you, Kate. Appreciate that. And thank you, Francesca. I'm really sorry to have jumped in and cut you off in your prime there, but was keen to get to some questions now. So look, please continue to put some questions forward. But I just want to ask both of you, Francesca looked at international examples and what Australia could learn from those, and that was indeed the brief that we gave her too. But are there what's Australia doing well, and are there examples here at all that international observers are watching?
Can I jump actually on this? Actually, the case studies in Spain was based on the work that we were doing here in Australia. So actually the international community is looking at what we're doing, especially on the fire side. We actually looked at internationally and really built on what we're doing. So that community program was actually based on the community program that was done in Victoria, and it was just integrated with another system. So we need to remember that we're doing something good. That was just a way of really topping it off with other elements. Queensland is working greatly around the natural disaster space, the retrofitting space. As I said before, there are programs, there are the buyouts, but there's also a program for retrofitting, and Queensland, I think, is leading. There is an element that we work in towards, which is great, and is the sharing of information. For example, in that Tulsa space is the disclosure of the risk. The communities, that is a really important part of risk awareness in the communities. So we're still experimenting with that, but I know there is some really interesting case emerging, which will probably go into the risk disclosure space. But I know there is, I think it's Gippsland's in Victoria that is looking at actually monitoring the hazard. It's now been they received federal fundings. They're actually looking at implementing this really detailed system, geospatial system that works on a 100 meters grid that gives them a response around multiple hazard and helps them taking decision, which we're monitoring. We don't know what's going to happen next, if it's going to be implemented or not. The federal government's very interested in this local government looking at this, but for now, we're really looking inwards. I think, especially around the flooding and the multi-hazard, we're looking inwards through government building capacity, and we haven't reached a point where this is facing forwards to the community. I think we're in a great space now where, unfortunately, and as happened in the history of Australia, these disaster events triggers innovations. That's mostly what we've seen that with the bushfire and the flooding is happening now. So all these systems are actually starting to emerging. So we're seeing this now happening, but they're not as structured. So we just need to reach that next level where we understand where this become more of a structural intervention. So, but I think the Gippsland one, it's a really interesting in terms of understanding multiple risks and where they can go, as well as the Queensland program around retrofitting and buyouts, and what that will play. So we are working in that space quite a fair bit. And there's all the other assets as well, all the elements around design, urban design for better improving and cooling down our places, guidelines that are emerging across different local governments. It's very hard to depict, to really get a full picture, because these things, as I said, are really happening at the local government level. It's very, very hard to really know what's happening. It's very much a bottom-up process, and we don't really have a full picture. I know there are other case studies, Kate, if you know some.
Yeah, Kate, what have you seen?
Look, there's lots of things Australia does well and lots of things that we're really behind in, like building code, for example. You know, we're still building really bad buildings. And we know if we're trying to reach net zero by 2030, every single building that's built now will need to be retrofitted because they're not high enough performing. Like, that's daft, right? Scotland's brought in passive house legislation, so all new buildings will have to be of a much higher standard than we're still building in Australia. And we know how hard retrofitting is. It's very difficult and very expensive and very specific to the property. So something that needs to change. But in terms of what we're doing well, like this bushfire management is when Indigenous knowledge is brought into bushfire management and traditional techniques are used, Australia does that really well. And I think that is being passed around the world globally to learn some of the techniques that are happening there. And the intersection between technology and Indigenous knowledge is really interesting. So some of the bushfire management drone activity that's happening at the moment that Minderoo are involved with is really exciting and probably quite leading, because we have such a, you know, fire weather. Does anyone else get fire weather on their apps other than Australia? There's lots of interesting things happening at the local government level, but it is very difficult to find out often and very fragmented and specific. I'll draw on another local City of Melbourne example because I work there, so I know that best. But lots of the grey to green projects that are happening there, so reclaiming wide roads and making them narrower, planting more trees, reclaiming car parking for urban greening. There's the GoCap, which was, I can't remember what it stood for, but thinking about how to green buildings, retrofit greenery onto buildings and develop some unique tools to allow developers in the community and the city to work together to be able to achieve that. So there is lots of innovations happening, but legislation needs to lead. You know, we need to legislate for an even playing field and drive forward that change and stop kicking the can down the road, because we don't have time. And the developers want it. You know, businesses want it. They want a level playing field, and we're not getting it.
Thanks, Kate. And Francesca, in your conversations as part of the research with with the various experts and industry and government people that you spoke to, what were you hearing on that issue around the need to legislate? And
I think there was a willingness to legislate. I've talked to people that mostly when it comes to government, they were working at state government level, and they do recognise that each one is trying to do their best. So we know that within the way in which the Constitution is done, land it's regulated at state level. And so each one trying to do the best they can with the capacity that they have, and the time that they have to dedicate that, and the resources that they have to dedicate that. And so they're really seeking some strong legislation and direction higher up to really playing the field amongst the different states, because there's a disparity in the capacity between different states of what can be done. There are some states, I was saying before, Victoria has legislated around climate change, where adaptation is part of the climate change legislation. And it does say, so all states legislate around mitigation. So everyone has some sort of target around mitigation. Victoria is the first one that also includes adaptation, not just mentioning it. The other mentioning it, it's not that it's not mentioned, but it poses some sort of requirement for action. It says, every 5 years you have to have an adaptation plan. We do have them on local government, but those plans that are kind of required in Victoria are sectorials, have a different level of reaching out compared to those local government adaptation plans. And so that kind of legislative framework is seen like it's really wanted. Like we sometimes it's really wanted in the terms to create a playing field amongst the different states and really making sure that we all working together towards the same goal. And at federal government level, we do have a climate change act, but there's only mitigation as part of that conversation. We're setting goals as part of our international obligation around our emission reduction. We're setting goals to what we need to go to 2050, but there's nothing around adaptation. And the issues of adaptation are only managed in the emergency space. So there's still not a crossover between adaptation as a holistic view of what we need to do and the emergency. So it's slowly happening, but in the governing structure, it's still quite divided, and that is reflected in the legislative structure as well. It's still solids addressed, so adaptation is not necessarily the same as emergency management in some cases. They overlap, but there's substantial difference. And the sustainable development is still not really part of that conversation. And that's, again, due to the way in which our government works. So they don't, by the fact that the federal government doesn't have really a say in urban policies, they have demonstrated some intervention in time. We've seen the city deals. We see now with the new government, they're really pushing forward. We have, other form of, but it's very much ad hoc because it's not part of what is asked by the federal government to kind of give leadership in that space. So it's a bit of a delicate topic there.
Yes, indeed. Well, we do have to wind up in just a second. So just to close off, if I can do my best to bring together a few things that people are asking. Look, this piece of research looked at what's happening internationally and what we might learn here. I guess just as a final question, to what extent do we need to keep looking at what other places are doing in order to actually solve our issues, or are we best to look at ourselves and I guess work out more from first principles what we need to do in our context and environment? Kate, do you want to kick off on that quickly?
Well, I think we should do both, right? Because often we're laggards. We're leaders in some things, but it's quicker to learn from others and learn from their mistakes and implement. I liked what you said about our own personal response, because I think it's really important to look internally. There's something called the internal sustainable development goals, and I think that's really important because the government should be legislating the will of the people. So we have to be asking. We have to be influencing politics, not just allowing them to influence us. So I think there's definitely a role for us all to play.
And quickly, Francesca, do you have a final comment?
Yeah, I do believe we're doing some great things here, which we don't know about. So maybe it is worth looking at what we do. I think, as Kate was saying, it's easier to look outside. And we've done so much, and the government spent so much money in actually implementing this. I think maybe we need to invest in understanding, having a full picture of what is done and how to bring it together in that sense. So you're looking internally at what we've done and knowing what we've done, because I know it's very much bottom up, and there's so many local government that are really leading the conversation around these things, and it doesn't really trickle up. It doesn't move up. So that's probably maybe the next project, looking at what great things are happening across Australia and how can actually inform that legislation and that kind of consolidating of this into the Australian space itself.
Yeah, thanks, Francesca. Appreciate that. That's, I think, a really good Closing remark, thank you very much for sharing your research with us. And Kate, thank you for your engagement and reflection on that. And we're looking forward to coming and seeing you at the Comedy Festival in Melbourne soon as well. Look, thank you everyone for joining us today. A quick reminder that we would appreciate your feedback if you can complete the survey that you get sent, and also that the webinar and a recording of it will be available on the AHURI website. If not tomorrow, then early next week. Thank you. Until we see you again, thank you for joining us today. Goodbye.